Welcome to Everything Casual, bringing you original football casual videos from the golden era of the 80s and 90s, right up to current day. Football away day stories and historic clashes between football firms. Subscribe so you don't miss out. We upload videos every week.
It was football's dark ages. So when I went to a football match in 80s, you knew there were going to be violence. You knew that there were going to be fighting. So you went and you were like, your adrenaline were going, especially if it were a big team like Birmingham, Portsmouth, Millwall, a local derby or something like that. You just knew there were a big crowd, there were going to be a load of trouble. And when I first started going, what they used to do is they used to come out of their end because there were no fences. They used to spill over onto pitch and run across pitch.
Yep.
And go into ends at away at home fans.
Hooliganism was born out of frustration, in my opinion. You know, people wanting to go to the match to escape, and they felt it a brotherhood of togetherness, or whichever way you want to call it. They were all together and they were all fighting as one.
I was in awe of them. I want to be like these guys. I want to dress like them. I thought, this is it. It's where I belong.
You had their back, they had yours, and that's the feeling that they gave each other. And I think that's why it was such a big problem for so long. These people with all different walks of life.
There would be solicitors, lawyers, doctors, and perfectly upright, normal members of the public during the week.
It's a dark time when football was in a really bad place, in my opinion. The terraces were chaos. There was violence on the streets. There was violence in city centres, at train stations.
Came out of train stations, about 78 of us. It just kicked off, bang.
Nobody was safe because this could escalate at any moment and could escalate everywhere as well. The young boy with the dart in his right eye, being carried by two policemen right along, it was truly frightening. I couldn't think of these kind of things happening in today's game.
The 1980s was the most violent, chaotic and unpredictable era English football has ever known. Terraces were packed, policing was stretched, and travelling away to certain grounds meant one thing. You weren't just risking your voice, you were risking your safety. Following the huge response to part 1, this is part 2, another 15 dangerous football grounds from the 1980s. 15 more places where visiting fans knew they had to watch their backs. And 15 more stadiums where the atmosphere could turn hostile in seconds. Let's jump straight in, by the way. This is in no particular order. 15. West Brom Albion, the Hawthorns. The Hawthorns in the 1980s was a deceptively dangerous away day. On paper, it didn't look like the most hostile stadium in the country. But the reality, very different. The stadium sits on the border between West Brom and Smethwick, two areas made up of long narrow streets, estates, busy pubs, and several natural ambush points. The Black Country derbies, in particular against Wolves, were and still are honestly regarded as one of the most fierce rivalries in the country. And then you had games against Aston Villa and Birmingham City routinely descended into running battles. Everyone seems to think that West Brom Section 5 and the Zulus are pally-pally, but viewers on here will tell you that in the 70s, 80s and 90s, there were many violent clashes between West Brom and Birmingham. Away fans often recall being ambushed as soon as they stepped off the trains at Smethwick Rolfe Street, or when walking along Halford's Lane. West Brom's home lads were territorial, and if they had been more organised, they would be right up there. Matches involving Stoke, Villa, Wolves, Birmingham, West Ham and Chelsea were notorious for eruptions of crowd disorder. Many visiting supporters described the Hawthorns in the 80s as a small ground with a big punch. And they weren't wrong. And the modern day Section 5 are no mugs either. A core band of top lads that are tight and have been so for years. Very handy, and will cause you problems home or away. Number 14. Bristol Rovers, Eastville Stadium. Eastville is rarely talked about today, but in the 1980s, it was a real hotspot for violence. The ground was surrounded by industrial estates, wasteland and hostile residential areas. Visiting supporters described the walk from Stapleton Road Station as a gauntlet. Inside, Eastville had open, exposed terraces that made crowd surges dangerous. But the real threat was outside. West Country derbies against Bristol City and games against Cardiff, Swansea, Newport and Exeter were among the nastiest in the region. The police often struggled to keep control in the narrow streets around Moller Road and the Eastville roundabout. Cardiff's Soul Crew, in particular, had numerous large-scale battles with Bristol lads in the 80s at Eastville, some of which made the local papers. Eastville wasn't glamorous, but it was unpredictable, intense and dangerous, especially for visiting supporters from rival West Country clubs. Bristol Rovers are rated. Number 13, Aston Villa, Villa Park. Villa Park in the 1980s was a cauldron that mixed huge crowds, fierce rivalry and a powerful hooligan presence. The surrounding areas, Witton, Lozells, Aston, all had pockets of hostility where visiting supporters could easily find themselves outnumbered. And those areas themselves are hotspots for violence, deprived parts of Birmingham. Just parking your car in the wrong place can get you in all sorts of trouble with the locals. The Villa Hardcore, the club's leading firm during the decade, were extremely active, and the names Fowler and Black Danny keep cropping up, especially during derby encounters with West Brom, Birmingham City and Wolves. The Zulus seem to get all the limelight and plaudits, but people tell me that Villa Hardcore were on an even keel with the Zulus and easily held their own. When Villa hosted northern clubs like Leeds, Manchester United, Liverpool and Everton, police presence was heavy but still often overwhelmed. Inside the ground, the Holt End was one of the biggest and loudest terraces in England. When the atmosphere turned, it became a boiling pot of adrenaline and aggression. And in an era when visiting mobs always tried to take a team's home end. I don't remember any stories of any mobs ever taking the Holt End. I could be wrong. Maybe a mob has taken the Holt End. Perhaps viewers themselves can answer that question. Villa Park didn't always get the headlines, but those who travelled there in the 80s remember it as a ground where violence could break out literally anywhere. I have a video all about Black Danny and the Villa Hardcore, so if you want to know their stories, then look out for this video on my channel. Number 12. Leicester City, Filbert Street. Filbert Street was one of the most claustrophobic grounds in the country, and the home fans were right on top of you. Leicester's hooligan element, the Baby Squad, became one of the most active, organised and feared mobs in the country during the 80s. They were young, fast, fashionable and absolutely relentless. And Filbert Street was their proving ground. If you arrived in Leicester wearing the wrong colours, you felt it instantly. The atmosphere tightened, the eyes were on you, and the tension could erupt in seconds. Inside the stadium, the double-decker stand was notorious. It was loud, claustrophobic, and filled with Leicester's most vocal supporters. Segregation was flimsy at best in the early 80s, and confrontations, missile throwing, and attempted incursions between sections were common. The noise created under that two-tier stand could rattle even established travelling firms. The streets around Filbert Street were packed with terraced housing and pubs. Away supporters often had to walk directly through hostile areas to reach the ground. Derbies against Nottingham Forest, Derby County and Coventry City were notoriously violent, and when big firms came to town, West Ham, Spurs, Chelsea, Manchester United, Leicester's Baby Squad were always ready. Inside the ground, the low-level stand was especially intimidating, and fights were frequent around the tunnel area and the double-fronted turnstiles. Filbert Street was a ground that kept your senses on high alert. You never knew where the danger would come from. If you want to know more about Leicester City Baby Squad and their battles and rivalries, then check out this video on my channel. Number 11. Sheffield Wednesday, Hillsborough. Hillsborough is best known for tragedy, but long before 1989, it was one of the most intimidating grounds in the country. The Owls Crime Squad, OCS, were active and organised, and they defended Hillsborough with fierce territorial pride. The derbies against Sheffield United were pure chaos, often involving hundreds on both sides. Visiting fans often clashed with Wednesday lads on Leppings Lane, Penistone Road, or the long walk from Hillsborough tram stop. Inside the ground, the Cop Terrace was enormous and incredibly loud. When that atmosphere turned hostile, away supporters felt the pressure instantly. Games against Leeds, West Ham, Chelsea, Everton and Manchester United regularly saw disorder, arrests and running battles spilling into nearby streets. Hillsborough was a massive ground, but in the 80s, the sense of danger was just as big. Number 10. Crystal Palace, Selhurst Park. Some people don't realise just how dangerous a visit to this place could be back in the day. When you mention a naughty away visit to London, people immediately think of West Ham, Chelsea and Millwall. Palace wasn't really on people's radar, and maybe that's why some mobs got caught by surprise and got caught out. Selhurst Park was surrounded by a maze of side streets, estates and alleyways that made it a nightmare away day in the 80s. Palace's home support was fiercely territorial, and large-scale violence often erupted around Holmesdale Road, Whitehorse Lane, or outside Norwood Junction Station. The Crystal Palace firm had strong links with the emerging South London scene, and they weren't shy about confronting visiting groups. Matches against fellow South London clubs like Millwall or Charlton were extremely high risk, but even trips from Chelsea, West Ham, Spurs or Arsenal often turned chaotic. Inside Selhurst Park, the Holmesdale Terrace was the place to be, loud and known for confrontations. With weak segregation and heavy crowding, fights could escalate quickly. Selhurst wasn't the biggest stadium, but it was one of the most unpredictable. If you have any stories to tell about a visit to Palace, or you disagree and they shouldn't be on this list, then, as always, let us know in the comment section. Every opinion is welcomed. Number 9. Burnley, Turf Moor. In the 1980s, Burnley's Turf Moor was far more intimidating than many outsiders realise today. This was a ground where the atmosphere could turn in seconds, where away supporters often found themselves massively outnumbered, and where the compact hemmed-in layout of the surrounding streets created problems long before a visiting fan even reached the turnstiles. Burnley might not have been a top-flight giant during this era, but Turf Moor earned a fierce reputation, one built on local pride, economic struggle, and a hardcore following determined to defend their patch. Burnley's hooligan element, often referred to simply as the Burnley mob in press reports of the time, with later groups becoming known as the Lunatic Fringe and the Burnley Youth and the SS. I can't say the actual name because YouTube doesn't like it, so we will just say the S Squad was deeply territorial and particularly active at home games. Their reputation was forged through numerous clashes in the early and mid-80s, especially as football violence spiked nationwide. Visiting fans, especially those from rival northern towns, regularly described Turf Moor as hostile, aggressive and volatile. One of the key factors was the geography. Turf Moor is surrounded by tight terrace streets that acted as funnels. Away supporters arriving by coach or train would have to walk through these areas, often with little or no police escort in the earlier part of the 80s. This gave Burnley's more active supporters multiple choke points to ambush or confront visiting fans. Many away supporters from the period recall having to run the gauntlet just to get into the ground. Inside the stadium, segregation was basic until later in the decade. The long side, in particular, was known for trouble. When Burnley were struggling in the lower divisions, matches could still explode into violence because the club relied heavily on local pride and a defiant US against them mentality. Even smaller fixtures against the likes of Rochdale, Stockport, Bury, Bolton, Preston and Tranmere produced disorder. The Daily Express and Lancashire Evening Telegraph reported repeated incidents at Turf Moor through the mid-1980s, including pitch invasions, running battles behind the cricket field end, and mass punching exchanges in the long side. In the 1984-85 season alone, Lancashire Police recorded over 60 football-related arrests connected to Burnley matches, with Turf Moor ranked as one of the county's highest-risk stadiums in their annual policing reviews. Burnley's relegation struggles also played a part. The club endured some of the toughest years in their history during the decade, culminating in the dramatic 1987 survival match against Orient, an event that saw massive police presence and crowd disorder before and after the game. When a town feels under threat, the fan base often hardens, and this was certainly the case in Burnley during the 80s. Away fans often reported that Turf Moor felt lawless at times. Fights regularly broke out in the away end, and there were several incidents of rival supporters attempting to invade Burnley sections, only to be repelled aggressively, leading to large-scale brawls. At night games, the tension was even worse, with limited lighting around the ground, creating blind spots that police struggled to control. By the late 1980s, Burnley had become known among travelling supporters as one of those away days you needed to be switched on for. Older fans frequently say that Turf Moor felt bigger than the club, meaning the aggression and tension surrounding the ground was disproportionate to Burnley's league position. That's what made it dangerous. Visiting supporters underestimated it and paid the price. Turf Moor in the 80s might not have had the national media profile of places like Millwall, West Ham or Leeds, but anyone who travelled there during that decade will tell you the same thing. Burnley away was no joke. It was raw, unpredictable, hostile, and always capable of kicking off. Please remember, the football grounds and firms mentioned are in no particular order. I just wanted to give them all a mention. Number 8. Bradford City, Valley Parade. Valley Parade in the 1980s carries a complex and heavy legacy. While most people today associate the ground with the tragic 1985 fire, many forget that throughout the decade it also had a reputation as a tough, hostile and sometimes dangerous place for away supporters. Bradford may not have had one of the country's most infamous hooligan firms, but the city's working class identity, the raw atmosphere at the ground and the local rivalries meant that visiting fans often found themselves in uncomfortable and sometimes violent situations. Bradford's hooligan element, the Bradford End, and later the so-called Ointment, was fiercely territorial. They weren't as nationally known as firms like the ICF, the Zulus or the Service Crew, but they were extremely active at home games. Matches against the Yorkshire rivals Leeds, Huddersfield, Hull and Sheffield clubs regularly saw violence in and around the stadium, with police often stretched thin across the steep streets and alleyways leading up to Valley Parade. One of the major factors contributing to the danger was the geography of the ground. Valley Parade sits high in the Manningham district, surrounded by narrow streets and tightly packed housing. These streets created natural ambush points, bottlenecks and blind corners. Away supporters arriving by coach or train were often walked through these areas with limited police protection in the early 80s. For many away fans, simply getting to the turnstiles sparked confrontation. Inside the ground, conditions could be volatile. Before the fire, much of the stadium was aging and wooden, and the terraces were tightly packed, creating flashpoints where rival supporters could easily get too close. Segregation barriers were basic, and it wasn't uncommon to see coins, bottles, and other objects exchanged between the Bradford End and the away section. The low-roofed sections amplified the noise and hostility, making the atmosphere particularly intimidating. During the early 1980s, West Yorkshire Police recorded several pitch invasions, assaults, and public order incidents connected to Bradford games. Local papers, such as the Telegraph and Argus, regularly reported on disorder spilling out onto Manningham Lane, one of the city's main roads, after big fixtures. The 1984-85 season, in particular, saw Valley Parade listed as a high-risk ground in police planning documents, largely due to local derbies and the growing problem of visiting firms targeting Bradford as an easy invasion. Matches against Leeds United were among the worst. The Leeds service crew viewed Bradford as a short, easy away day with the potential for major trouble, and several clashes occurred both inside and outside the stadium during the early 80s. Huddersfield and Hull were also notorious fixtures, with running battles on Midland Road, smoke bombs thrown onto the pitch, and large-scale disorder both before and after games. Even lower-profile fixtures could be dangerous because the Bradford hardcore was known for its willingness to engage on home turf. Reports from the era mention frequent outbreaks of fighting behind the Kop, confrontations in the main stand paddocks, and violent scenes outside the ground when rival firms attempted to storm local pubs. And then there was the added tension following the 1985 tragedy. The emotional impact on the city amplified the sense of tribalism and defiance. Many older fans recall that late 80s away visits to Valley Parade were marked by a simmering hostility, outsiders entering a traumatized community that felt protective, defensive, and, at times, confrontational when provoked. Valley Parade wasn't the biggest or the most notorious ground in the country during the 1980s, but it was unpredictable, edgy, and tightly packed with local pride. Away supporters frequently underestimated Bradford and the area around the ground, only to find themselves in difficult or dangerous situations, both outside on the steep streets and inside on the terraces. For those who travelled there regularly in the 80s, Valley Parade was a ground where you kept your head down and your wits about you. It was loud, emotional, territorial, and always capable of sparking trouble. Whilst we are talking about Bradford Ointment and Valley Parade, I just want to give Daniel Wright a shout out. Top lad. His book, Northern Monkeys, in my opinion, is one of the best football casual books out. It's not just for Bradford lads. Anyone interested and knowledgeable about the football casual scene can relate to it. It's funny, naughty, violent, and current, full of away day stories. I have made a video just based on the first chapter, so check it out, and then go and get the book. Number 7. Arsenal Highbury. Highbury might not be the first stadium people think of when discussing the most dangerous grounds of the 1980s, but for away supporters who travelled there during that decade, the reality was very different from the modern image of Arsenal as a polished, family-friendly club. Back in the 80s, Highbury was a hostile, claustrophobic, and unpredictable environment, one where violence could erupt quickly both inside and outside the ground. Arsenal had a strong active hooligan element during this period, with groups like the Gooners, the Herd, and later the Clock End Boys being involved in numerous confrontations. While not as widely mythologised as Chelsea's Headhunters or West Ham's ICF, Arsenal's firms were well organised and deeply entrenched in the culture of North London street fighting. Their control of the Clock End and surrounding pubs made Highbury a place where visiting firms had to tread very carefully. One of the key factors behind Highbury's danger was geography. The stadium sat tightly within a residential North London district, surrounded by narrow terrace streets and alleyways. Away supporters were funnelled to the ground through routes that passed several Arsenal pubs, making ambushes and confrontations almost inevitable on big match days. Gillespie Road, Drayton Park, and the area around the old North Bank entrance were hotspots where police struggled to control groups of Arsenal lads looking for a tear-up. Inside the ground, segregation throughout the 80s varied in effectiveness. The away section, mostly the Clock End in the early part of the decade, was notorious for trouble. Fights often broke out when rival supporters managed to infiltrate home areas, and coin throwing, bottling, and surges on the terraces were frequent occurrences. The North Bank itself, one of the iconic terraces of English football, was loud, militant, and intimidating. When Arsenal were up for it, The noise and hostility made the atmosphere deeply uncomfortable for visiting fans. Several high-profile incidents in the mid-80s added to Highbury's reputation. Matches against Tottenham, Chelsea, West Ham and Manchester United regularly descended into disorder. Spurs fans recall being ambushed outside the 12 Pins and again on Avenel Road as they approached the ground. Chelsea firms attempted clock-end takeovers multiple times, leading to clashes both inside and outside the stadium. In 1983, a match against West Ham saw large-scale fighting break out behind the clock end due to a breakdown in segregation, one of several occasions that season where Highbury was at the centre of major football-related disorder. Arrests at Arsenal home games rose sharply during the middle part of the decade, with Metropolitan Police reports from 1984 to 86 listing Highbury as a high-risk venue, particularly for derbies. By 1986, Arsenal were averaging over 40 arrests per season at home matches, with many more ejections and reports of smaller fights that never made headlines. Arsenal's firm identity also played a role. Unlike some clubs, whose hooligan groups were mainly active away from home, Arsenal's mob had a strong presence on their own ground. The clock end was considered one of the most solid home ends in London, and away supporters often found themselves vastly outnumbered, especially at evening games when tensions tended to peak. Add to this the intense North London rivalry with Spurs, one of the most bitter in English football, and the potential for violence was always high. Matches between the two sides throughout the 80s regularly ended in running battles around Finsbury Park and Holloway Road. Despite its elegant exterior and the home of football image, Highbury in the 1980s could be a volatile and dangerous place. The combination of Arsenal's firms, tight surrounding streets, fierce London rivalries, and inconsistent segregation created an environment where away fans had to be alert and often wary of what might unfold. For those who experienced it firsthand, Highbury was not the sanitised all-seater stadium Arsenal supporters remember today. It was a tough North London fortress, one defended fiercely, often violently, and without apology during football's most lawless era. If you want to know more about Arsenal's herd firm and all the other mobs they have produced over the years, then check this video out on my channel. Number 6. Wolverhampton Wanderers, Molineux. Molineux in the 1980s was a completely different beast from the modern Premier League ground people know today. During that decade, Wolverhampton was a club in decline, often surrounded by financial turmoil, decaying stadium infrastructure, and a fan base hardened by years of economic pressure. This combination created a raw, edgy environment that away fans often found deeply intimidating. Wolves' hooligan element, most associated with the subway army, named after the notorious subway that ran beneath the ground, was extremely active during this period. The subway itself became one of the most infamous ambush points in English football. Rival firms that underestimated Wolves often found themselves caught in violent confrontations before they even reached the turnstiles. Molineux was surrounded at the time by derelict land, old factories, abandoned buildings, and poorly lit walkways. Visiting fans frequently reported feeling vulnerable around the ground, especially for evening kickoffs. The police presence was inconsistent, and Wolves' younger element developed a reputation for being unpredictable, aggressive, and willing to confront bigger firms head-on. Inside the ground, segregation could be fragile. The old South Bank was a cauldron of noise and hostility, and when Wolves were struggling on the pitch, that tension often spilled over. Bottles, coins and stones were thrown between sections, and pitch incursions weren't uncommon in the early 80s. Matches against West Brom, Birmingham, Villa, Stoke and Cardiff often ended in violent scenes inside and outside the stadium. West Midlands Police recorded over 50 arrests, connected to Wolves' home matches in the 1983-84 season, a high number for a club that wasn't in the top flight. Combined with the physical layout of the area and the reputation of the subway army, Mollin, you became one of those grounds where away supporters knew they had to keep their heads down. In the 80s, Wolves away wasn't glamorous, it was dangerous, hostile and notoriously unpredictable. Number 5. Sheffield United, Bramall Lane. Bramall Lane in the 1980s had a reputation that modern fans often overlook. Today it's seen as a traditional proud old stadium, but in the 80s it was known across the leagues as a tough, hostile and sometimes downright dangerous away day. The combination of Sheffield United's hard-edged fan culture, the violence of the Blades business crew, and the brutal industrial environment surrounding the ground meant trouble was rarely far away. Sheffield United's main hooligan firm, the Blades business crew, BBC, grew significantly during the 80s and developed a reputation as one of the most underestimated but highly capable mobs in the country. They weren't showy, they weren't media darlings, but they were feared. The BBC were territorial, aggressive, and had complete command of the streets around Bramall Lane. Visiting firms who thought they could stroll through Sheffield often found themselves heavily outnumbered and caught out in side streets or pub districts. Brammall Lane's location played a huge role in its danger level. The ground sits between tight-knit residential streets, old warehouses and industrial estates, which in the 80s created natural choke points and ambush spots. Away fans walking in from Sheffield Midland Station often described feeling exposed and boxed in long before they saw the stadium. The area around Shoreham Street and Bramall Lane itself could become a battlefield on derby days or when a well-supported club came to town. Inside the ground, things weren't much calmer. The old John Street and Shoreham Street ends were packed, loud and intimidating, and segregation in the early 80s often consisted of little more than a few police officers and a thin line of fencing. The Brammall Lane Terrace could be a cooker when United were up for it, and the atmosphere created by the BBC and older Blades lads made away fans feel very unwelcome. Matches against Leeds United, Sheffield Wednesday, Birmingham, Millwall, West Ham, Stoke and Cardiff were particularly notorious. Leeds brought the service crew, Wednesday brought the Owls firms, Millwall brought the Bushwhackers. United's lads didn't shy away from any of them, and the results were often violent. The Steel City derby fixtures of the early and mid-80s were among the most explosive in England, with large-scale disorder before, during and after the games. Police reports from the era frequently listed Bramall Lane as a high-risk venue for major incidents. By the 1983-84 season, South Yorkshire Police recorded dozens of arrests connected to United home matches, and unreported flare-ups in the surrounding streets were even more frequent. Pubs around London Road, Bramall Lane, and the city centre often saw clashes both before and after games, particularly when firms attempted walk-ups on each other. Another factor was the gritty culture of Sheffield itself. The city was still heavily industrial in the early 80s, and the working-class toughness of the area was reflected in the fan base. United supporters prided themselves on looking after their own ground and making sure rivals didn't enjoy their visit. The BBC's reputation for direct confrontation meant that even small groups of away fans risked running into trouble. And then there was the pitch invasion element. United had a number of matches in the 80s that descended into chaos, with supporters spilling onto the pitch, sometimes to confront opposition fans on the terraces opposite. Games against Leeds, Wednesday and Birmingham saw fencing tested to breaking point. Brammall Lane wasn't as famous as the Den, the Bridge or Upton Park, but for fans who were actually travelling around the country in the 1980s, it was widely known as a seriously tough place to go. The stadium was loud, raw and fiercely protected. The streets around it were unforgiving, and the Blades business crew ensured that anyone stepping onto their patch knew they were in hostile territory. For away supporters in the 1980s, Bramall Lane was, without doubt, one of the most dangerous and intimidating grounds in the country. If you want to see more about the highly rated Sheffield United BBC firm, then check out this video on my channel. Number 4, Bristol City, Ashton Gate. Ashton Gate might not appear high on the national hooligan radar today, but in the 1980s, Bristol City had one of the most underrated but fiercely territorial followings in the country. The city's economic struggles and the collapse of the club in 1982 created a siege mentality among supporters, leading to numerous outbreaks of violence at home matches. City's main hooligan group, the City Service Crew, or City Service Firm, was exceptionally active and earned a reputation across the lower leagues as a firm capable of holding its own. Ashton Gate became a difficult place to visit, especially for rivals from the southwest and Midlands. Cardiff, Bristol Rovers, Swindon, Plymouth, Birmingham and Wolves all had serious clashes at the ground during the decade. The geography around Ashton Gate contributed to the danger. The ground sits deep within the narrow streets of Bedminster, a tough working-class district where away fans were often funneled past city pubs and meeting points. Violence regularly broke out on Winterstoke Road and Duckmoor Road as visiting supporters made their way in. Inside the stadium, segregation during the early 80s was often basic. Away supporters could hear every insult, every taunt, and every threat from home fans in the East End. Fights frequently erupted when small pockets of away fans were discovered in home sections, and police struggled to keep order during derby matches. The 1984-85 season saw multiple pitch invasions and clashes at Ashton Gate, with Avon and Somerset police reporting over 40 football-related arrests, a high number for a lower division club. Cardiff games were particularly violent, with running battles both inside the ground and on the streets outside. Ashton Gate wasn't a glamorous or high-profile away day, but it was one the old-school fans remember vividly, because trouble was never far away. Number 3, Swansea City, Vetch Field. In the 1980s, Vetch Field wasn't just a difficult away day, it was one of the most intimidating, unpredictable and genuinely dangerous grounds anywhere in Britain. Swansea, especially during the club's dramatic rise and fall in the early 80s, developed a fierce, no-nonsense fan culture that turned certain fixtures into outright battlegrounds. What made the Vetch so notorious was its cramped, hemmed-in layout, with tight streets surrounding the ground, terraced housing right up against the turnstiles, and limited police control in those confined alleyways. Away fans often felt like they were being funneled into a trap. If trouble was coming, you couldn't avoid it. There was nowhere to hide, and nowhere to run. The most dangerous spot by far was around the North Bank, Swansea's main end and home to some of their most vocal and aggressive lads. The atmosphere was suffocating, loud, hostile and unforgiving. Visiting fans described it as stepping into a cauldron where the temperature was already boiling before a ball had even been kicked. Swansea had a reputation for being a tough, hard-edged city, and their firm, often referred to broadly as the Swansea Jack Army Lads, gained a reputation for being fearless and fiercely protective of their turf. They were known for quick, organised mobbing, especially in the tight back streets around the Vetch, where the police struggled to break things up. If you were an away fan in the wrong place at the wrong time, you were in trouble. Adding to the danger was the sheer passion of Swansea supporters. The club's meteoric rise under John Toshak brought huge crowds and an electric, often volatile atmosphere. Big-name teams arriving in town turned the area around the Vetch into a pressure cooker. Pubs rammed, alleyways blocked, chants echoing through the housing estates. flashpoints were inevitable. Leaving the ground could be just as risky as arriving. Away fans were often directed down narrow routes, where bottles, bricks and coins were not uncommon. Stories of full-scale chases into the city centre were part of the folklore of Swansea away days. In the 80s, Vetch Field was the definition of an away ground, where you kept your head down, moved quickly and hoped for the best. No fancy policing, no sterile segregation, just raw hostile territory where the atmosphere could turn on you in seconds. For many who experienced it, Swansea away at the Vetch sits firmly among the most intimidating and dangerous fixtures of the entire decade. Number 2. Bolton Wanderers, Burnden Park. In the 1980s, Burnden Park was one of the rawest, roughest and most intimidating grounds in the country, a place where away fans often walked into Bolton territory completely unaware of what they were about to face. The stadium, ageing and crumbling, sat right in the middle of tight terrace streets, giving Bolton's hooligan element, especially the Cuckoo Boys, the perfect home advantage. Bolton's firm in the 80s wasn't the biggest in the country, but they were notorious for being vicious, unpredictable and fiercely united, especially on their home turf. Burnden Park gave them exactly the environment they needed: hidden cut-throughs, alleyways behind the old stands, blind corners and choke points where away fans could be boxed in within seconds. The most dangerous area was without doubt the Manchester Road end, where Bolton's most vocal and active lads gathered. The atmosphere here was always on edge, tightly packed, loud, aggressive and buzzing with tension. When big clubs visited, the noise and hostility inside the Manchester Road end were enough to shake even experienced away firms. Segregation at Burnden Park in the 80s was minimal and unreliable. The old terraces were easy to infiltrate, and more than one away fan found themselves isolated and surrounded before the game had even kicked off. Objects being thrown was commonplace: coins, bottles, stones and even bits of terracing. The ground was showing its age, and so were the rules of engagement. Outside the ground, things could get even worse. Burnden Park was built right up against the surrounding housing, creating a maze of narrow back streets where the Cuckoo Boys operated with complete confidence. Coaches were often attacked before they even reached the away end. Pubs around Dean Road and Derby Street were absolute no-go zones in the 80s, strictly home territory that could turn violent the second an unfamiliar face walked in. Bolton away in the 80s also had the reputation of being a revenge fixture. If a club had brought trouble to Burnden Park the season before, the Bolton lads remembered, and they came looking. There was a real edge of score settling about certain matches. The police presence was often stretched and reactive. Burnden Park's layout made it nearly impossible for them to keep rival groups separated once the final whistle blew. Running battles spilled into the retail area car parks, the railway station nearby, and the streets heading back into Bolton town centre. Even veteran hooligans from other clubs have admitted that Bolton in the 80s wasn't to be underestimated. The Cuckoo Boys had a reputation for punching above their weight, fast, aggressive, and 100% ready to defend their patch. For many visiting supporters, Burnden Park was a reminder that some of the most dangerous away days weren't necessarily the biggest clubs, but the ones with the roughest grounds, the tightest streets, and the most determined local lads. A trip to Bolton in the mid-80s could go from tense to terrifying in a heartbeat, and countless fans still remember it as one of the most intimidating away fixtures of the decade. If you want to see more about Bolton and all their firms, battles and rivalries over the years, check out this video on my YouTube channel. Number 1. Tottenham Hotspurs, White Hart Lane. White Hart Lane in the 1980s was a cauldron of noise, aggression and tension, and it was widely considered one of the most dangerous places for away fans in London. Spurs hooligan firm, the Tottenham Massive and Wide Army, were one of the most active in the capital, especially in the mid to late 80s, and their presence made the lane a very hostile environment for visiting supporters. The area surrounding the ground was full of terrace streets, narrow alleys, and pub clusters, where Spurs lads gathered before big games. Visiting supporters walking up from Seven Sisters regularly found themselves outnumbered, stared down, or directly confronted. On derby days, the police struggled to hold main routes together, and violence frequently erupted on White Hart Lane, Tottenham High Road, and in the tube stations. Inside the ground, the Park Lane and Shelf side were intimidating terraces. Spurs fans packed these ends tightly, producing a fierce atmosphere that many away supporters recall as overwhelming. Segregation wasn't perfect, and coin throwing, surges and confrontations across the fences were common. Spurs rivalries were among the most explosive in the country. Matches against Arsenal, Chelsea, West Ham and Manchester United regularly descended into violence. The Arsenal derby was one of the biggest flashpoints of the decade, with multiple large-scale incidents in the 80s, both inside the lane and outside on Tottenham High Road. In 1985 to 86, Tottenham home matches produced over 60 arrests, one of the highest totals in London outside of Chelsea and West Ham. Evening games were particularly dangerous, as darkness gave cover for ambushes and made police control even more difficult. Spurs fans also had a reputation for defending their home aggressively. Spurs lads rarely backed away, leading to some of the most notorious battles of the era. White Hart Lane in the 80s was loud, volatile, territorial and unforgiving. For away supporters, it was a ground where anything could happen, and often did. I have made a few videos about Spurs, their mobs, battles, their characters and faces over the years, all here on my channel. If you feel I have missed a team out that should be on this list, then let me know in the comment section. All comments and opinions are always welcome. New videos to look out for coming soon. Bradford Ointment, Northern Monkeys, and the day Portsmouth, 657, took on 3 different firms, the naughtiest away day ever. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you subscribe, you will be notified when we release a new video. It could be your firm we make a video about next, so don't miss out and hit the subscribe button. You can find me on Facebook or email me if you have a good story to tell. See you next time.